Well, thank you all for being here. I'm Alec. I'm a PGY1 in psychiatry here, and we've got another Yale Psychedelic Science Group presentation tonight. I'm excited to introduce our guests, but also I'll let my co-host here, Rob, introduce himself.
Hi, y'all. My name is Rob Palmer. I'm a medical student at Yale, co-hosting tonight. Thanks for joining us. Looking forward to the talk.
Awesome. So I think Dr. Wenthur's talk will, we'll give him as much time as he needs to give his formal presentation, but there will be time at the end for Q&A, and we'll be monitoring the chat. If you have thoughts or anything you want to contribute during the talk, and then of course questions, whatever, just raise your hand or unmute yourself. You should be able to do that, and we'll have a good discussion. Some really exciting stuff that Dr. Wenthur's been working on over at Wisconsin. Just a little bit about him. He's a PharmD and PhD, and a translational investigator in psychopharmacology. He's been at UW-Madison since 2018, but trained at Purdue as well as Vanderbilt, and was at the Scripps Research Institute for some time. And his work is really diverse, he's a very, he does science in a lot of exciting ways in a lot of different areas. So is interested in addiction, in neuroplasticity, and the use of these psychedelic compounds. So I will let him take it away here. Thanks again for being here, Dr. Wenthur. Excited to have you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alec, for the introduction. Thanks, everybody, for joining in. So today, we're going to focus in on sort of two themes for what my lab's been working on recently. That's polypharmacology and sort of extrapharmacologic factors. As a pharmacist, right from my beginning training, the idea, that all we need to know about is the drug was kind of the foundation of my training, but obviously that doesn't really hold true for this class of compounds. And, we often oversimplify mechanisms of action, even for compounds that we think, we know work really well. So we're going to be talking about a couple different translational products, some in preclinical work and some in clinical work, hopefully with a theme that you may see across a couple of the projects, particularly interested in the role of sort of how either biologically induced stress or environmentally induced stress may be modifiers for long-term outcomes. So in general, this is a very simple overview of the heuristic of the kind of things that my lab works on. So we develop antibodies against psychoactive molecules as ways to dissect their pharmacology, and also as potential interventional or diagnostic strategies. Opioids and cannabinoids fall underneath that jurisdiction. And then, as Alec indicated, we're also interested in through collaboration with others, the phenomena of neuroplasticity based on kind of historical training and interest in prefrontal glutamatergic systems and metabotropic glutamate receptors. But in this space, we're also very interested in psychedelics and dissociatives, and we'll hear about ketamine and psilocybin in particular today. So I'm not going to give a huge amount of background today, guessing this audience is very familiar with all the general information on psychedelics. But the one thing I do want to point out from this recent review that Matt Banks and I put out is just this concept that usually psychedelics as catalysts for change have been conceptualized as introducing change through multifactorial mechanisms, right? So both at the level of the cell, right, and by introducing potential bias signaling underneath the 5-HT2A receptor and introducing several signaling pathways there, but also through potential action at multiple receptors, and then also through the generation of systems level effects, for example, release of glucocorticoids. And of course, these interact with psychological, perceptual, cognitive alterations. And so there's a lot going on here outside of just, the molecule acting at 5-HT2A as an agonist, as if that explained the whole outcome. And with that, the projects I'm going to talk about today really do fall underneath this theme of psychoactive drugs beyond a single target. So of course, with psychedelic compounds, we have direct polypharmacology. We're not going to be talking a lot about that today, but of course, it's important to note that, in addition to actions of 5-HT2A, there are many other serotonin receptors involved, dopamine receptors, adrenergic receptors. But then there's even more possible influences in the polypharmacology space, such as metabolic polypharmacology. And we're going to be talking about this in the context of ketamine fairly briefly today. So, ketamine normally conceived of as an NMDA receptor antagonist, but there's also very interesting stories about downstream metabolites with ketamine, particularly the hydroxynorketamines, which can introduce potential activity at alternative targets, so that you get the presence of multiple active species acting then on multiple targets. In a story with psilocybin, we'll be touching on the idea of systems polypharmacology, where a compound that itself, again, may already have some direct pharmacology, can also, through its interactions with systems, result in additional activation of receptor or other targets, such as through the release of those glucocorticoids that we talked about interacting with downstream receptors. And then within the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy approach, there's all these extrapharmacologic factors that we're fond of calling, set and setting as our sort of shorthand heuristic. So these are the general rapidly acting antidepressant types of research projects we've got going on in the lab, again, broken down into preclinical and clinical studies. We'll briefly touch on ketamine, an approach that we developed called dissective, and the idea of mapping these neuronal ensembles. Spend a lot more time looking at psilocybin-induced glucocorticoid release and anxiety-like behavior in rodents. And then I think I have one slide on this recap study, which my colleague Paul Hudson probably already mentioned, so I'm not going to belabor that point. And then we'll focus more of the clinical side on this project that I call Poesis, psychedelic outcomes intersection of environment, self-identity, and success, looking at the relationship between what individual participants bring to the table and how it might modify their long-term outcomes, and potentially mapping a path forward toward quantifying those types of interactions. So here we go with project one. This project was born out of an idea that I had a couple years back, actually from an article in the San Diego Tribune, where it said pill allows fighters to kill with reckless abandon. And it was like a very sensational title talking about the Syrian civil war and this compound I'd never heard of before, phenethylene, which turned out to be basically a synthetic combination of a xanthine and an amphetamine type compound that upon metabolism liberates kind of one of each of these. And at the time I was working in the Janda lab at Scripps, and they've been developing small molecule directed antibodies for a long time. And my question was, in psychiatry and in neuropharmacology, right, we often have these scenarios, whether it's post-metabolism or it's a natural product, that there is a psychoactive chemical mixture that's making its way into the CNS, right? It's not just one agent, it's a few different things. And so it can be really hard to tease apart what's going on from a mechanistic standpoint. And the idea was that if each of these compounds, both known and unknown, are crossing the CNS to induce discrete effects that we can measure, if we can generate antibodies that block them from entering the CNS. If they were already peripherally restricted, it would have no effect. But if we apply these to compounds that were entering the CNS, we can then observe the loss of particular effects for each of these drugs independently, as well as in combination, and then just use sort of a logical process to derive those effects that are related to a single compound, combinations of known compounds, unknown compounds, or combinations of known and unknown compounds. And so that's was a ripe place, I think, to try and address this prevailing question in the world of ketamine pharmacology, which is, what's the major actor in the efficacy of ketamine? And certainly, I think there's good evidence to show that ketamine alone as a molecule does have significant effects through its actions at NMDA receptors. But there's also been a lot of interest in these downstream metabolites, which are the hydroxynorketamines, and particularly these two diastereomers, the 2R, 6R, and 2S6S hydroxynorketamines, and their potential to act at other targets, things like presynaptic metabotropic glutamate receptors, as well as direct actions on AMPA receptors, modification of TrkB signaling, for example. And there's a lot of controversy over whether these on their own could be therapeutically valuable, but we're particularly interested in this project in asking the question, are there emergent effects when you have ketamine followed by liberation of the hydroxynorketamines, that the actions of one versus the other are not the same as the actions of both occurring in the brain. And the current state of this area is especially interesting because in mice, for example, if you give discrete 2R6R hydroxynorketamine, it's reproducibly been shown that there's antidepressant-like effects in models that are classically used for predictive antidepressant efficacy. Although, of course, these animals aren't depressed, they're just being used in preclinical models. Whereas in recent studies in humans, we actually have seen the opposite, where the higher the concentration of hydroxynorketamine that's been measured in individuals, the smaller their response on clinical scales like the MADRS. And so there remains this open question of what is the contribution of this metabolite, and at what points is it operative? And because it's a post-metabolic product, it's really hard to disentangle what 2R6R hydroxynorketamine is doing in the absence of ketamine. And so we wanted to use this technology to try and answer the question. And to make a long story short, probably not as many people in this area interested in medicinal chemistry. Basically, what we did was made small molecule mimics of ketamine, which the structure is sort of embedded here, linked to an immunogenic protein. This is C-reactive material. It's basically an inactivated diphtheria toxin species. And then we also made one that mimics hydroxynorketamine, right? And this was a bit of a tall order, we thought, because the only chemical differences are the loss of a methyl group and the addition of this hydroxyl group. So making antibodies that can distinguish between these two species is pretty tough, right? In comparison, for example, to the carrier protein, this is hundreds of Daltons. This is tens of thousands of Daltons, right? And so, but antibodies are pretty amazing, right? We can make huge quantities of diverse antibodies and select for them. And so we thought we had a shot. And at the end of the day, so far, the most selective antibody that we have to date is the hydroxynorketamine antibody, where we have basically 1,000 to 400-fold affinity improvement for the hydroxynorketamine versus norketamine and ketamine. I think there's still room to improve, certainly for ketamine and norketamine, but we were very excited that we could actually dial in this type of selectivity. And what we've been doing recently is trying to validate the contribution of hydroxynorketamine to those behavioral effects, where, as has been seen previously in the literature, if you give hydroxynorketamine alone, you get this reduction in immobility time. In this experiment, again, using the forced swim test, if you give ketamine and then we vaccinated with either the norketamine, ketamine, or hydroxynorketamine vaccines, you can see that we could get a selective reversal of the effect of ketamine in those animals where hydroxynorketamine itself couldn't cross the blood-brain barrier, indicating that it does, in fact, have an important contribution, at least in this species and in this model. And so the next place we're wanting to go with this is to actually move from the level of behavior back to the level of the brain and to image ketamine activated neuronal ensembles. And I hope I can get this to go. So what we're doing is using the clarity approach to take mouse brains and make them optically clear, and then through immunohistochemistry stain for markers of immediate early genes. In this case, we're looking at C phosphoreactivity at the time point immediately after ketamine administration, and do a global analysis in these whole cleared brains of regions that are activated by ketamine, by hydroxynorketamine, or by ketamine in the absence of hydroxynorketamine in our vaccinated animals, to identify those regions where there may be emergent activity. And certainly we can start seeing some interesting regions pop out, hippocampal regions in this sample, but certainly more work to be done on this front, so stay tuned. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that project. From now on, it's all psilocybin. We'll get to real psychedelics now. So project 2 is looking at psilocybin-induced glucocorticoid release and anxiety-like behavior. I'm sure we're all familiar with, or at least have heard other people note this quote from Humphrey Osmond. I'm putting it up here just to make a note of, the stressful components of this statement. So fathoming hell, certainly likely to be stressful. However, soaring angelic, like rapture, awe states, these are also going to be anxiety provoking and stress inducing. So absolutely, I think a worthy area of investigation for trying to understand the global picture of the effects that psychedelics are inducing. And this is data from Franz Wohlenweider's group. Hosler is the first author, where you may have seen this with increasing doses of psilocybin. There is a significant transient increase over the first basically 2 hours of cortisol, particularly at the highest doses, which returns to baseline by 300 minutes. But the other thing that was also reported in this paper, perhaps unsurprisingly, is as we get to the very high doses, the rates of psychological reports of anxiety, like anxious ego dissolution, also increase at these very high doses. And there's correlative data, right, indicating that dread of ego dissolution is negatively correlated with long-term outcomes. But there's also this counterpoint argument that's addressed in this paper by Ari Brower and Robin Carhart-Harris, as well as in other papers, talking about the idea that challenging states or stress-inducing states may actually be part of the functional benefit of psychedelics, particularly through inducing the sort of highly neuroplastic background on which these experiences can occur. The idea being that these pivotal mental states can lead to either negative or positive psychological outcomes because of that change in plasticity and the elevation in 5-HT2A signaling that's often induced by different forms of stress, and that which path is being taken is highly dependent on other factors such as the setting, expectation, and the therapeutic container. So I thought this was an interesting question from that front. And our hypothesis was basically that we thought the biological component of a drug-induced stress response could be beneficial to modifying long-term anxiety-like behavior, but also that this was worthy of understanding from the preclinical standpoint in general, just as a confounder. And here we see a recent paper from Yuan group in Iowa looking at corticosterone as a confounding factor for ketamine's actions. And I encourage anyone interested to take a look at that paper, quite interesting. And so what we did was we undertook a series of experiments in preclinical models where we wanted first to outline basically what is the timeline of the acute experience or the acute change that we can measure in mice, and what is the time course of the post-acute period when we can be confident that the drug has been removed from the system, and then look at measures of anxiety-like behavior across those different time points and associate that with either corticosterone release or not. And so on the left-hand side, what we're looking at are pharmacokinetic data from animals that were dosed with 3 milligrams per kilogram of psilocybin intraperitoneally, and just measuring the plasma time course over time. And we can see that by 4 hours, essentially all of the psilocin has left the system. And this is a dramatically longer time course than the time course at which the psychological effects, maybe I'm speaking too much for the mice, the obvious behavioral effect in the form of head twitches occurs. So there's a clear peak at 10 minutes, as others have seen. This sort of rapidly decays with a half-life of about 11 minutes. By 1 hour, the head twitch response is gone. So we were pretty confident that if we measure at about 15 minutes, we're somewhere in this peak range where head twitches are occurring, and at 4 hours, we're in the post-acute phase after the drug has cleared the system. And what we measured first was a simple task, the open field task, where mice are put in an open arena. They're thigmotaxic. They like to stay around the edges because the center is a place where they feel more exposed. And looked at the dose-response relationship between the time and center. So more time and center is generally interpreted as being anxiolytic like phenomenon, less time potentially anxiogenic. And what we saw was this sort of inverted U-shaped curve where low doses of psilocybin induced a little bit of a anxiolytic response, but then as you went up, you saw dose-dependent angiogenesis during the acute time. This is, not surprising. They're having some change in perception, presumably at this time. So at the high dose, they're not moving in the center. But interestingly, at 4 hours, we see the exact opposite pattern, right? So now the highest dose is actually inducing angiogenesis beyond what was seen at baseline. And I don't have the data shown here, but it's worth noting there's no significant effects on overall locomotion in these animals at the 4 hour time point. So there's this acute angiogenesis, but a post-acute angiolysis. And if we look at psilocybin-induced glucocorticoid release, as we saw in the human data, there is a significant increase in plasma corticosterone, which is the rodent analog of cortisol, at 15 minutes that resolves by 4 hours and stays back down to the same levels up to 168 hours later. Just so you note it, animals that get psilocybin or that get saline also do have an increase in their plasma corticosterone relative to baseline, which will be important in a couple slides. This we expected to see because you're handling the mouse, giving it an injection. It's a stressful experience, but is certainly a notable, if not significant, increase above baseline. And then when we look at this post-acute time point, 4 hours, at the behavior in novelty suppressed feeding, which is again a measure of anxiety-like behavior. They're again in an open arena. This time it's especially brightly lit. There's been food restriction overnight, so the animals are motivated to feed. And then there's a sweetened pellet put in the center of the arena. So there's this balance between approach and avoidance behavior. The animal has to decide whether it's basically worth it to go and feed. And we measured the latency till the animals do that. And here you can see each of these points is the time point at which an animal was feeding. And we see a significant reduction in the time to feeding for psilocybin versus saline, again indicating that there's this post-acute anxiolysis. The dose dependence of this phenomenon doesn't appear to be especially strong across these doses, although we do see some shift toward the left or further anxiolysis at the 3 milligram per kilogram dose. Now, if that glucocorticoid release is an important mediating factor, we would predict we should also see this for other scenarios where you get that increased glucocorticoid release. And if we use lisiride, which is a non-hallucinogenic 5-HT2 agonist, or ketamine, we also see this increase in plasma corticosterone. And likewise, we see a significant leftward shift or anxiolytic phenotype at these time points. And what's especially interesting is if we give repeated saline injections. So we give saline, we wait 15 minutes, and we give another saline injection. So they have repeated bouts of that administration-induced stress. This can actually recapitulate the acutes of psilocybin post-acutely. And so it might actually be that glucocorticoid-induced release that's the key factor for understanding this anxiolytic phenotype in the post-acute period. And this corresponds fairly well with other recent reports, such as reports that if you give corticosterone after an acute stress response, you can actually prevent delayed effects on amygdala activation. And that, for example, if you give a vehicle injection under these same conditions, that it can recapitulate the effects of diazepam, basically due to that repeated stress or stress inoculation phenomenon. So that is possibly relevant for this behavior. But the other thing that we wanted to do was look at longer term behaviors, right? That might be an important confound, but we wanted to go further out to understand what the relationship of stress might be on effects even further out. And so we went back to the open field test in these same animals and saw a dose-dependent effect where they spent more time in center 7 days later with psilocybin, which was significant. This, interestingly, was not the case with lisiride or ketamine or other interventions that induced a glucocorticoid release. And then we went ahead and tried to manipulate the ability of the drug to actually induce a glucocorticoid response by providing them with corticosterone in their water chronically. So this increases the level of corticosterone overall in the animals. So they have high levels of stress-associated hormone. After withdrawal, they fall below baseline due to the negative feedback effects. And when they have high levels of the chronic corticosterone, we no longer have a significant increase in plasma cort acutely with psychedelics because the system is already sort of at maximum response. And we see in animals that have received that chronic corticosterone that there is a significant rightward shift post-acutely. So we lose the anxiogenic effect. If the corticosterone is subsequently withdrawn, we can recover that effect. That's also true for ketamine. And most interestingly of all, what we see is at that 7-day time point that, whereas before psilocybin was anxiolytic, it was reducing the anxiety-like behavior, increasing the time and center, that in animals where they had unresolved long-term elevations in corticosterone, that there was a significant interaction effect, and psilocybin actually appeared to be anxiogenic. So there's two things that are interesting here. One, the acute drug-induced stress response appears to be supportive of post-acute anxiolysis and long-term anxiolysis. And two, if that stress is unresolved at the biological level and there's continuous increases in plasma corticosterone, we actually see long-term angiogenesis, right? And one can imagine this in the clinical sense, where if someone has an acutely stressful experience that's subsequently resolved through integration, they may have a good outcome. Whereas if for whatever reason they have an unresolved, acutely stressful experience that persists and they have anxiety over that, it might actually go in the opposite direction. So that's obviously interpretation beyond the scope of this data, but I think a worthy area for further follow-up. Okay, we're done with mice. We've gotten past the chemical structures. We've gotten past the mice. So now we're in the realm of humans. Like I said, we're just going to put one slide on this project, which is the recap project. A whole host of great investigators at UW-Madison helping with this project, trying to look at whether conscious awareness is actually necessary or correlated with the long-term outcomes in treatment of depression. My role on this project is largely related to developing the memory battery and the actual assessments for whether the individual is having a psychedelic experience and whether they can recall it in the future. We're still enrolling subjects, things are moving forward, and very excited about this study, but we'll spend no more time talking about it. Although I'm happy to entertain questions about it. The last project that we'll spend the rest of the time talking about intersects with the glucocorticoid story in that I believe there's reason to think that different levels of stress are going to be experienced by different individuals in our psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy protocols. These are data from Monica Williams and colleagues, formerly at UConn, she's now at Ottawa, regarding ethnic or racial representation in psychedelic medicine studies. So although almost 40% of individuals in the United States are people of color, only 11% of individuals in psychedelic trials are people of color. So this is an important issue for health equity reasons, but also for generalization reasons. So do we have efficacy in the clinical trial? That's one question. Do we have effectiveness in the general population? A separate question. And this type of difference, I think, is especially relevant in the context of psychedelics for reasons that I'll elaborate on in the upcoming slides. But we've recently been funded to help run this study. As I said, it's called poesis, the idea being that poesis is the act of making something from where nothing was before. Psychedelics are acting as these meaning-making effects, and that the meaning that people are making from their environment may actually be dependent on their own self-identity and the relationship with the set and setting where they're getting the drug. And I just have a few quotes here to suggest, as others have suggested, that self-identity is probably a key piece of set and setting. Quotes from both therapists themselves who have a Black identity or other marginalized identities like LGBTQ identities, saying things like, there I was with my two therapists and my wounds, trying to make sense of a new reality, a culture my body knew, a language my mind did not. Some moments of feedback are making me more confused, angry, and frustrated. I said to my therapist, you don't understand what I'm trying to say. Or things like, during integration, I was able to process some of my experiences, but much of it happened weeks, months, and years after the session, partly due to time to process, but also because I was nervous to mention some aspects of my culture which showed up, fearing I would be misunderstood. And then in sort of the opposite direction, there was an incredible experience of being seen and heard as a queer person of color in a white heteronormative society, simply by having an older female therapist of color sitting patiently across the room, conveying acceptance, nurturance, and non-judgmental permission to open up about my issues. And so I think if we take that information, we have two pretty strongly supported givens that lead to an important logical outcome, right? So if set and setting influence psychedelic treatment efficacy, and self-identity influences set and setting, then the logical output is that self-identity influences psychedelic treatment efficacy through this medium of set and setting. And the tack that we're taking on this project is to start with a discrete domain of the built environments in which these psychedelics are being administered. Certainly, there's already been investigations of the influence of music in this environment, which I think are extremely valuable and should certainly continue. But there are also other elements of the environment, like the art, the guides, the preparation sessions, the tasks. And to make this simple, you can imagine hanging in our dosing room, right? There's art on the walls that someone had to select. Someone had the choice to hang up a medicine wheel or a cross, right? And depending on your race, religion, your history with the land, your response to those two items is likely to be very different. And so we can conceptualize the fit of setting with self-identity as a therapeutic modifier, where if your identity is congruent with the set and setting, you may pass through and get maximal therapeutic effect, whereas if it's not, your outcome may not be as good. And again, what we're trying to do is use art objects as a starting point to develop this quantitative fit scale for set and setting. So here in Wisconsin, right, where America's Dairyland, we might choose to put up a picture of a cheese shop. In Baltimore at Hopkins, they might choose to put up a crab picker because you can't go anywhere in Maryland without hearing about crabs. And that might work for some individuals in the setting, it might not work for others. But what we want to do is try and understand to what degree that's true. And we want to try and get a fit score across participants to really understand how close the set and setting matches their self-identity, where if you have a close match with set and setting, you may have a stronger therapeutic effect or weaker. And you could use this quantification score to get a fit normalized effect across different sites. This could help us validate patient choice in the setting, something we already do, but might also help us harmonize data across sites in multi-site clinical trials. And ultimately, the goal is to eliminate those hidden variables and maximize the benefit for all, where we have a set and setting that is flexible, adaptive to different individuals, and where everyone can get the best therapeutic effect possible. And so the study we're working on has two components, the first of which is a community engaged outreach survey and focus group component, where we're asking individuals about their demographics across 4 different dimensions: age, gender, race and ethnicity, and spirituality and religion. We then do object familiarity and preference, 9 groups of those across items drawn from our psychedelic dosing room, and then assess the reaction to objects in the room and their perceived connection to these elements of their demographics. In our first pilot study, we had 42 participants from the Madison Psychedelic Society. 34 of those completed the entire survey. And in our pilot study, what we found was that we had a good spread across age, a decent balance of male and female genders, a smattering of different spiritual or religious traditions, but as others have reported, predominantly white respondents in the absence of any efforts to try and fill a quota sample or oversample other groups. So this was evidence to us in the first place that we needed to do a better job of trying to actively reach out to individuals with non-Hispanic white identities, which is what we're doing in the next phase of the project that's ongoing now. And so to give you an example of kind of how this is being operationalized, in our community survey, this object is one of the objects that's in our dosing room. In addition to cheese, we also have a lot of lakes in Wisconsin. So I guess someone chose that. We actually don't have a picture of cheese in the room. I feel like I'm putting that wrong message out there. And then we asked, what is your reaction to this on a scale of 0 to 100, with these markers being shown very positive, neutral, or very negative. And then what is your perceived connection? So between extremely, not at all, to these various elements of your self-identity. And when we did that across 15 different objects for all the different participants, what we saw was that if we asked binary yes or no, is there a connection, that there was statistically significantly a much greater probability that individuals would say these items connect to their spirituality than any of these other dimensions. And for those individuals who said yes, when we quantified the degree of that connection against the connection to spirituality was the highest of these. Looking across all the items in our room and also asking about the reaction of the room itself, the average across all the discrete items was about the same as the room. So we think that aggregating this data is actually giving us meaningful information kind of in the whole as well. And then we had varying reactions across all the objects in the room. Notably, all of them were at or above the level of neutral. So I guess someone did a good job of picking the objects. The most liked object was this large scale picture of a tree. The other one that was significantly more liked in the room overall was this image of, not image, but a little statuette of mushrooms. And when we tried to develop this fit score, what we did was did a multiple linear regression to look at the relationship of the variables age, gender, race, and spirituality on whether it influenced their preference for either the room overall or for the aggregate total of all the items. And what we found in this initial sample was that spirituality was a significant predictor of people's response to the item as well as to the room overall. You'll notice in this case that race didn't come up significantly, but I'll also remind you that in this initial sample, our number of individuals with an identity other than non-Hispanic white was very small, only 6 individuals. That being said, if we do stratify individuals by non-Hispanic white ID or any other ID, we see that there is a trend toward lower reaction to the dosing room overall for individuals who have an ID that's anything other than non-Hispanic white. And then if we look at the connection to the dosing room overall, what we see is that there's a significantly lower perceived connection to the individual's own race for those people, again, who have an ID other than non-Hispanic white, which isn't true when we ask them about dimensions that don't have to do with their self-identity, like, do you perceive this room is connected to the local environment? Do you perceive that it's connected to the history and traditions associated with the use of psilocybin and psychedelics? And so building on this pile of data, what we're doing is continuing to engage and incorporate this survey and focus groups beyond our local environment. So moving from Madison Psychedelic Society, we'll work with Milwaukee and Dallas and trying to expand to other sites, Baltimore, San Francisco, trying to find folks all over the country. And in particular, building these focus groups in so that we can get quota samples of individuals from groups, from folks who've already raised their hand and said, yes, I'm interested in psychedelics. Yes, I self-identify as African-American or Native American. And we can gather information from them about their perception of not just the dosing room, but also psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy protocols and engagement with research as a way to listen. Because I think that's the first thing we need to do is hear what the state is on the ground before we can jump to trying to intervene. The other portion of the study is making a small change in our local dosing environment based on trying to make the environment a little bit more flexible. And to that front, we also asked participants in our phase 1 PK study retrospectively about their experience in the room. And in comparison to the study sample we just saw, the PK individuals who actually had a dosing experience in this room had a more positive reaction to the room. So that's interesting. And then they also had somewhat different reactions to the objects themselves, with the biggest shifts, of course, being the shift in the room overall, but also, interestingly to me, in object 14, which is this fairly innocuous looking glass, right? But this is actually the place that the psilocybin capsule is placed in and presented to the individuals. And so if we do our head-to-head comparison, for example, between this object and then those mushrooms, the individuals who are just generally interested in psychedelics but hadn't been dosed in the room tended to prefer greatly the mushroom image, whereas individuals in the PK study on balance preferred the chalice that was associated with the drug itself. And this was statistically significant, again, with a very small n. We'll see if this holds up as we increase those, but evidence that the experience in the room actually then does change people's subsequent opinion of it, which is not surprising, but it is interesting that it holds up with the idea that you may have very changed precepts about pretty mundane objects. Overall, the PK participants are having a really good experience in the room, at least those who decided to answer the survey. We did get a good response rate from what was a very small study, but certainly that caveat applies. And when we asked them about what was the relative importance of different elements of the study room, the people and the drug itself were the most influential. The music was also quite influential. The physical objects significantly less than the drug, but not than these other elements. The land and surrounding environment the least, and their own expectations were also really important. And so what we're trying to do as a small change to try and make our dosing environments a little bit more flexible and equitably accessible to individuals, both of different self-identities, but also people who may have different levels of resource access, is to put in a frame, a digital frame that can display art of the participants choosing from a menu that we're developing in collaboration with the Chase Museum of Art to hopefully have a more representative set of images. It might not actually be all that important what the art is. It might just be more important to make that offer, but that's something that we're also doing as part of this study. So overall, thanks very much for listening. A couple take-home messages. I think it's really important to understand polypharmacology. We can use selective antibodies as tools to try and piece apart pretty complex mixtures. The post-acute effects of psychedelics may actually be dependent on a stress-like response and are sensitive to chronic fluctuations in corticosterone. And then we really need to do more study regarding how self-identity influences relationships with the environment, and that there seems to be some pretty good evidence showing that it's worth our time to do so, to make this a more accessible environment for everyone. So thanks for taking the time to listen. These are our funding sources, and happy to entertain any questions.
Well, thanks a lot. It was a great chat and a great talk. I'm looking forward to conversation here. If people are able, please feel free to put your video on to facilitate discussion, but no pressure. And I know one question that's lingering on my mind is, the objects that are meaningful to people. Sure, they can be things that they pick from a selection, but is there ever thought of having people bring personally meaningful objects from their home or from their family? I know in outside clinical settings that like creating almost a ritual or an altar of sorts for a psychedelic experience can be very powerful for people. And I wonder your thoughts on like operationalizing that as a scientist and trying to bring that, across.
So ultimately, I think the type of question I'm trying to answer is that a reproducible effect and something that we can feel comfortable with as scientists and convince regulators that that's not an uncontrolled intervention, right? So yes, I think it's a great idea. I think the more meaningful an object is to someone and more relevant to their therapeutic journey, the better, right? So what we're trying to do is start with something where we have at least some control over this to indicate yes, we can quantify the degree to which patient fit with the set and setting correlates with outcomes, and thereby support the notion that we're not actually introducing a hidden variable, but we're minimizing variability by enhancing the fit score across individuals by doing things like making that offering to bring in personally meaningful objects. So I think that's one important thing. The other important thing is just the notion that for individuals who may be more socially unstable or have housing instability, for example, the offer to bring in something meaningful to them or might be more challenging, right? Or someone who's had a very recent traumatic experience because their house burned down or they were in a hurricane or a tornado, having the ability to choose something that feels like theirs is one sort of hidden benefit of having a menu also.
Great. And I see Sabio's raised his hand.
Thanks. This was awesome. I really appreciate, Alec, like what you mentioned something in that was kind of something I was pondering too. And I guess just one thing I wonder, I guess a couple things like with the whole Poesis study, I guess, are there avenues for other places and other regions to be able to get in touch with you guys to kind of like collaborate on this? Because like where I'm at in residency, it's I feel like it's pretty unique. We're in Eastern North Carolina, and it's like probably like 40% of our patient population is like non-Hispanic white. So mostly Black and Latino, and also like a mix of like rural and urban. And I feel like the South is also kind of like culturally different than a lot of places, especially where a lot of this research has gone on so far. So that was one question, how to get kind of in touch, if that's like a thing at all. And then the other was just given, especially the feedback and I guess some of the stuff you pointed out about the huge, or I guess the impact of the actual facilitators there, as far as like not just the objects in the room, but the facilitators themselves. I guess that just kind of makes me wonder about what then can be done to kind of like not just, yes, keep building the body of evidence, but be like, hey, let's kind of like fast track this and like be like, hey, this is a wake up call. Cause I notice this as a resident all the time that like I can connect with patients a lot better than in a way that they're more comfortable with than, maybe somebody who they don't have a similar identity with at all. And that's, I don't know, to me, something that I hear a lot, I guess in medical education, I hear a lot of lip service on, but I don't see the rubber meet the road a lot.
Yeah, two great points. The first one is, Yes, absolutely. We're looking for more partners. The more geographic diversity we get, and the more diversity that we get in general across, the scope of the U.S. population, the better. I put my email in the chat, so please do feel free to reach out, because we're actively looking for partners in many different places. To the second point. Yes, I also agree with that. The lip service issue is a real one. The way in which I've been trying to help address this is I also serve as the director of our recently launched Psychoactive Pharmaceutical Investigation Master's program. And we dedicate half of our scholarship dollars to individuals from underrepresented backgrounds so that they can access the program, because I think you're right. Until we get more people with whom patients can empathize on the therapist side, on the investigator side, we are literally just changing the window dressing. So to me, I think the first place to go is there's a lot of people, who want to give money and have given money to the development of psychedelic trials and protocols and centers. I think we need to do a better job of saying we need to earmark some of these dollars to train facilitators and scientists who represent our entire community.
Thank you. I really appreciate you addressing that. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing it up.
Hi, this is Emmanuel Schindler. Great talk. I had a question on the topic, going back to the mice a little bit. So I've been studying psilocybin in different headache disorders here at EL. And the topic, this has come up in a couple different talks about whether you have to have a good experience to have a lasting therapeutic effect. For headache disorders, it doesn't seem to matter whether you have a good experience, a bad experience, or no experience. Patients can still get better. So is there evidence that patients who have a bad trip do worse, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so to me, this mechanistically remains an open question, because I think the strongest level of evidence that we've got is correlational, right? Where it's okay, if people report that they have high levels of dread, ego dissolution, or other anxiety, they're more likely to have a smaller effect size for something like major depressive disorder. But that's not causal data, and it doesn't tell us what happened kind of in the interim. And I think the mouse data, to me, speaks to the fact that sort of not all drug-induced stress is likely to be negative. But then I think the recap study in people is really where the rubber is going to meet the road. And the idea there is we're giving an amnestic agent together with psilocybin so that we can have people report that they are having a psychedelic experience. But then hopefully, if we get the dosing right, that a day later, you ask them, how did it go? And they say, how did what go, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answer is going to be true, across disorders, right? Like you said, maybe for more neurologic, applications, it's utterly irrelevant. Whereas for specific psychiatric disorders, it will turn out to be more relevant. But I think the notion drug-induced stress equals universally bad is way too simplistic.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any similarity, but with the decades of self-reports of patients using psychedelics to manage headache disorders, and in my studies, as we all know, psychedelics can actually generate headaches as an acute or subacute side effect. And in my studies and in the self-reports, that was very common, that the psychedelics would generate one headache, but then they would get better. So I don't know if there's something similar where I like to, my hand waving is that, oh, it's shaking up the system and then it turns it off. So, so I don't know if there's anything similar where it's stressing that system that is generating headaches, and then, but in the long run, it's worth it. No pain, no gain. Type. So I don't know if that's if that's similar to, if that has any similarity to what you were talking about, but I find it very interesting.
Yeah, I think there may be some parallels there. Certainly, others have made the case that 5-HT2A is sort of uniquely positioned as a stress responsiveness system. So, like 2A gets upregulated in acute stress. The idea being it's sort of mobilized to deal with it and overcome it, right? A not uncontroversial idea, I think, not to be done to kind of prove or support that approach, but it has as much or more data, I think, than other theories around it. So yeah.
I had a quick question for actually Dr. Schindler. With your headache studies, the dose that's being used, maybe there's multiple studies with multiple different doses, but are they at sufficient doses to produce a fairly subjective change, or how have you all set that up?
Yeah, so in general, there are a couple doses that I'm looking at, but 10 milligrams would be the highest that I go, and that's based off of what patients who self-manage their headache disorder tend to use is a lower dose, and of course that's a dose where some people don't feel very much, and some people have the full experience. And I found that what expectations people come in with makes a big difference. So those people who already had experience with a psychedelic or were very interested in psychedelics had a stronger experience than those who are I just need something to help with my headaches. They don't care what it was. They didn't have as much of an experience. But yes, it's definitely, people can tell. Our studies are also different in that we have the setting is a medical setting. It's a setting as if you're going to get dialysis or something. Not we don't have those huge machines, but yeah, it's a medical outpatient setting with the vitals machine, and we have an IV. So that's a very different setting, but it's a medical setting, which is still something that can that can make people feel more comfortable and perhaps affect the outcome. So there are certainly differences in how the headache studies are being run.
Awesome, thank you. And Rob's got his hand up.
Sure. Well, first of all, Dr. Wenthur, thanks so much for that talk. It was a really cool range from the very, very micro to the more macro, and I really appreciated that. Related to the first part of your talk, I was curious if you had any thoughts on the R versus S ketamine versus a racemic mixture. Not something with which I have a ton of familiarity, but I know it's obviously a hot subject, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think there's evidence that maybe S-ketamine was not as obvious of a choice as it first appeared. I think a lot of that was based on sort of receptor affinity, where it was, okay, this has more affinity for the NMDA receptor, so it's got to be the good one. But at least in terms of the metabolites, if you start with R-ketamine, you can get to 2R6R hydroxynorketamine. If you start with S, you can't get there. And there seems to be a stronger effect of 2R6R hydroxynorketamine. So I think, diving into the enantiospecific piece is going to continue to be an area of interest. And I think it's more than just the parent molecule, right? It's also the metabolites that are accessible from the parent molecule. I guess the the gambler's choice would be to use racemic, which is cheaper and can access both. But yeah, from a mechanistic dissection standpoint, we're not using enantiospecific haptens at present, but that's kind of a next phase, right? Is can we actually get down to the level of dissecting between diastereomers and enantiomers? If we thought that, you know, two small chemical modifications was a hard goal, that one is verging on perhaps impossible. But we'll probably try.
Fair. Oh, well, thank you very much for that answer. It's been something that's been kind of scratching in the back of my mind for now a couple of years. So
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, and is it Pasha?
That's right. Hi, thank you for a really interesting talk. I had kind of a follow-up question related to ketamine clinically. So yeah, like Rob mentioned, the metabolite question is really interesting, and like obviously, like you said, in the clinical data is, you know, after path wasn't super, metabolite on its own hasn't done really well. And I'm wondering for the CPOS, what are you all doing? Are you doing just like ketamine, S-ketamine metabolite, or are you trying to hit the metabolite since you have such good profiling of the, but it's synthetic, at least in a rodent, and then maybe scale it from there?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but I think I got the gist of your question. So yeah, for the neuronal ensemble mapping, what are we planning to do in terms of, you know, our interventions? So first, what we want to do is ketamine plus minus vaccination, right? So we get either the full spectrum of ketamine and its metabolites, or we've selectively removed the 6-hydroxynorketamine from that milieu, right? So that will tell us, right, is there something that disappears, for example, when we remove that piece. We can also compare that to the hydroxynorketamines alone. And then the other approach is using genetically modified animals where we can get, you know, long-term expression of markers downstream of these immediate early genes, is to give one of those interventions first, right? So give, for example, the hydroxynorketamines first, wait, close the window in which the neuronal ensemble marking is occurring, and then use an orthogonal or alternative measure when we give ketamine in the presence of a monoclonal antibody that will mitigate the influence of the 6-hydroxynorketamine, for example. And then you could have two markers and look for overlap in those neuronal populations. So those are the type of interventions we're looking at. I think the idea of, sort of controlling it kinetically, right? Like doing a wave of ketamine and a wave of hydroxynorketamine is pretty interesting, and maybe something we could achieve, but not an immediate plan.
Again, it sounds very cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask about the methods with which your group is using to reach out to folks who are not identifying as, non-Hispanic, Caucasian. Like, I see there's like these psychedelic interest groups and such, but even those may be self-selecting for certain people. So what are like the outreach methods that are being used?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, from what we saw from the Madison data, that's certainly true, right? The group in this, our psychedelic interest group, had basically the same demographic mixture as the clinical trials do. So I think outreach and interfacing is really important. We've made a couple baby steps with campus partners to try and reach out to local communities, but frankly, I've been trying to go very slow on that front and kind of deliberately going to those psychedelic interest groups and then trying to oversample folks from with non-Hispanic white identities because they've sort of already raised their hand, right, to say, you know, this is a topic that's of interest to me, because from the feedback that we have gotten, the most important thing is to develop a relationship and to make sure this is something that the community is actually, you know, interested in and feels will help them, and not sort of an exploitative, yeah, we're coming in to get data in group X and then leaving, right, which has happened time and time and time again. So, you know, I don't want to say we're doing nothing, because we're not, but the level, the pace of progress is deliberately slow, where there's colleagues, you know, within the School of Pharmacy who are experts in community engaged research and just kind of at the relational development stage to make sure that the roots and the connections have time to develop before we really make any asks.
Rob, did you have a question?
Yeah, double dip again here. My question now is thinking about the kind of like the corticosteroid, like the chronic corticosteroid administration. And I'm just curious, is that a dose that you gave? Is that like super physiological? And the reason I ask in part is because I find it interesting in that a lot of kind of traditions, there's in the preparation phase, there's an emphasis on like, hey, don't look at the news, don't watch scary movies, avoid these kinds of noxious, stressful inputs in the week or weeks or whatever leading up to this experience. And I just wonder to what extent, like, we're seeing in some ways like a kind of a, you know, these lines of evidence or practices kind of converging in some sense. So I'm just curious if those doses of like, you know, stress hormones or glucocorticoids are ones that we would never really see in the wild, or is that something that's at least somewhat resembles what we'd see in the real world? Because again, the results were rather striking. It's like, oh, you can more or less see a negation of the benefits and actually even like a worsening, it seemed like. So
yeah.
just
So yeah, the rodents, right? So big asterisk there, but basically the levels that we saw from the application of corticosteroid that we were giving exogenously, which was passive through the water. So it was 80 micrograms per mil in their water for 28 days. The plasma concentrations that we saw after 21 days of that were approximately equivalent to the peak that we saw with psilocybin at 15 minutes and within the range of, you know, the psilocybin, lyseride, ketamine administration. So I don't think they were like outrageously super physiologic. I didn't show data. We did do an experiment where we gave like, I think it was 2.5 milligrams per kilogram of corticosterone, like immediately acutely before the psilocybin, which induced, you know, a hugely super physiologic change. And that did suppress the psilocybin induced glucocorticoid release. We had a small number of animals. It had a similar qualitative effect to what I showed, but there weren't enough animals to sort of give you statistics on what the long-term effects were. But to your key question, I don't think we were crazily outside the realm of what's physiologically possible. And your point, you know, of saying, okay, you're not ready for this because you've had too much stress, and being in different traditions is one that's really interesting to me. And I think dovetails interestingly with an observation that pivotal mental states paper, which was, you know, there are alternative traditions where during the experience itself, or basically the experience itself is kind of an ordealogen situation where you're undergoing a very severe physiological stressor that may or may not involve psychedelics. And so it might be this delta, right? The difference between what was it before, what was it at the peak, what is it after? That's the key differentiator, right? In whether you see the positive effect or not. So I think, yeah, it seems like there's two ways you can go to maximize that, right?
Yeah, I just find it super interesting because now it's like we're not just thinking about, I mean, it gets very back to a lot of the cliches of like preparation, right? And this is not just a 6-hour intervention now. This is an intervention that can, if you want to conceptualize it, takes weeks before and after, or months, depending on how far you want to take it. So yeah, really cool to see kind of like a biological underpinning potentially of that, what's been talked about for a long, long time.
Yeah.
First of all, just again, amazing talk. A question I have is, have you, I think like when we start to think about like clinical application of psychedelics, one avenue forward is to do it in a group setting. And have you thought about, how set and setting in like a group setting, what we'd have to consider and like what aspects would really influence like doing psychedelics in a group?
Yeah, I think I've heard a lot of people discuss it, and certainly there are historical and contemporary examples, right, of group use of psychedelics. And so I, in this case, just have to defer to those experts. I certainly don't oppose that idea at all, but I don't have any particular special insight that I think they wouldn't have. For the very narrow purposes, right, of the study that I was talking about today, it's just not a dimension I think we could explore simply because of the limitation of the actual footprint of the room that we are in. So that's a very unsatisfying answer, but the appropriate one, because there are other people much better qualified on that front. It's also it's an empirical question that I think we're just going to have to explore.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just, as we like move towards potentially exploring that, I just didn't know if you had any like thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I can only share what I've read and sort of what I shared in that one slide, which and Sabio's suggestion that I think there's strong data to indicate that participants and patients actually report, higher levels of empathy with people who share their same social identities. And so trying to facilitate that to the greatest degree possible, makes good sense as a place to start.
Thanks.
Well, I think we're booked till 8, but I feel like maybe if things are slowing down a little bit, we could end a little early. It's really awesome, awesome presentation and discussion. Something I'm still thinking about is when you mentioned it, it's like, of course, when you administer a drug, there's all these prodrugs, all these metabolites, and we think we're studying one drug when we do these, any psychopharmacologic study, and it's humbling to realize just how much we're fooling ourselves sometimes when we think that drug A means effect B. Very humbling thing to think about, but.
Yeah, I mean, and I think just to put a plug in, since we do have, a few extra minutes, is the possible avenues, by which to explore the distinctions between synthetic isolates and complete natural products, right? Because there are certainly individuals more, who are interested and ascribe to the idea of an entourage effect. And in the case of ayahuasca, certainly we have like an explicit, decoction or potion with multiple psychoactive components in it. So I think a lot of fertile ground on that front to try and identify the contributions of, not the stars, but the role players, right, in these type of preparations. And same thing applies to use of cannabis, for example. So we'll see. I'm obviously partial to this idea of using the dissective method, but it is a pretty laborious approach. And so I look forward to, seeing what we do as a scientific community to try and continue to work on this longstanding and challenging problem with polypharmacology, because I think we've got powerful enough tools now that reducing, molecule A to target B to affect C is, we can do better.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. And thank you all for being here. And I believe we have another talk in about a month or so, but be on the lookout for emails, and you can sign up for our mailing list if you're not currently on it on the website. Just search Yale Psychedelic Science Group. All right. Thanks again, Dr. Wenthur, and have a great night, everybody.
Thank you very much. It was
Bye-bye.
an honor and a pleasure. Really
Yeah.
appreciated being invited to your community tonight.
Great. Thanks.